So we will start. So welcome you all to yet another episode of EVC. It's Essential Vaccinology course, the virtual session. Today we are having a little bit different topic from vaccinology. We are having a topic on how to read a research paper. So to deal with that topic, we have an excellent faculty, Dr. Barney Isaac, who is the professor, Department of Pulmonary Medicine, CMC Vellore. He is a true product of CMC Vellore. I think he has been in CMC Vellore for the last 25 years or more. So being a pulmonologist, his field of interest includes interstitial lung disease, diseases of neuromuscular junction diseases, sleep disorders, and also his another interest is this evidence-based medicine and research methodology. He's having a lot of publications in his name in index journals, and at present he is the principal investigator for more than 7 research projects in CMC Vellore. So as I already told, biostatistics and evidence-based medicine is his topic of interest. So we are quite lucky that we got a apt faculty for today's. So he's a prolific speaker and an excellent teacher. So with these words, I welcome Dr. Barney Isaac for the talk.
Thank you very much, sir, for those kind words of introduction. I hope I am audible and my slides are visible full screen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You're audible and your slides are visible.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, once again. And I think it's an honor and privilege to have a cross-specialty talk from being a pulmonary physician to a pediatrician, to a pediatric group. So I really appreciate your invitation, and I hope I will do justice in the next 1 hour. So I plan to take the session for about 45 minutes and then try and have about 10 minutes of discussion. I have the title given to me is how to read a research paper. But I think to read a research paper, there's a lot of background that is important to know. So I would be touching upon the backgrounds here and there, and keeping the promise I've given to Dr. Krishna Mohan, I'll keep it as simple as possible and as understandable as possible. And I would ask you to pause and ask question at any point in time. You don't have to wait till the end, because I think it's important that we understand. This is not a lecture. This is a interactive session where we all, at the end of it, are able to understand how to read a research paper well. So when we all read a research paper, we usually have 2 reasons why we read a research paper. One is we want to present it for a journal club during our post-graduation internship, and as we move along, there are journal clubs in different situations where we would like to choose an article and read. The second is where we want to understand an article because we need to apply what is there in that article in our daily practice. It is going to change our practice. For example, when COVID vaccines came into the market, there was a lot of trials done, and a lot of trials were done very quickly because of the shortage of time. And it is important to understand these research papers to know whether what we are administering to our patients is appropriate. Now, Professor Doug Altman is a pioneer in statistics, and he made this statement: to maximize the benefit of research to the society, you not only need to do research, but you need to do it well. Now, I think we can't stop there. We not only need to do research well, but we should also know to read research well. If I need to put it along the title that has been given to me. But I want to go one step further and say that we not only need to just read research well, we need to critically appraise the research. which is very important, because if you just read through something, you may not get the depth of it, you may not realize the bias of it, the problems with it, and we may just blindly practice what is being said in that research article. So it is very important to critically appraise a research paper. Now, when each one of us plan research, look at a research article, the first and the fifth steps are more related to journal club. The 2, 3, 4 steps become very important. We need to select an article, particularly if it is for a research article, journal club, or we need to select to see if we are practicing is appropriate, we have to make any changes. We need to select the article. We need to understand what that article is. So that is more like reading the article and knowing what it is. The third step is very crucial, which is the critical appraisal. And then we need to clinically apply the outcome of the critical appraisal. And then if it's for a journal club, we need to prepare the presentation as well. So selecting the research article is it can be based on various of these methodologies. One is it may be based on a research question. You have an outbreak of diphtheria in your hospital, and you want to know if giving diphtheria vaccine would enable would prevent the subsequent ENT specialists or the pediatricians from acquiring diphtheria, transmitting it to others, and so on. But it can be a research question that you have and you go and research. It can be sometimes based on the study design, because for journal clubs, sometimes we assign, okay, today's journal club is going to be on a randomized control trial. So you look for randomized control trials. Or sometimes it can be.
Excuse me, sir. Yeah. Your voice is breaking a little bit. So is it a problem due to the earphone, or?
Was it like that from the beginning?
No, for the last 2-3 minutes. Not breaking, it's having some disturbance in the background. Can you try without the earphones, sir?
Without the earphones, it may not pick very well. So what about now? Is it better now? No. No, not better now. Is it same?
Some audio disturbance is there.
Okay.
You can try talk a little bit louder so that it will be okay.
Okay, I'll try to switch off the fan. If you can just give me, I don't know whether that's disturbing. Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, it's okay. It's better.
Better. Yeah. Please let me know if it doesn't get well enough. So it can be based on a journal that you want to choose from. So if there's a pediatric particular international journal which is where quality articles are being published, you may choose your article from there. It can be based on a topic you want to choose from. It may be, say, vaccinology. So you choose the vaccine journal for that particular journal club. Sometimes there are landmark studies which are published, which have changed the course of a particular practice in a particular specialty. So that sometimes is the reason why you select an article. But sometimes it's just about selecting a good one just by searching on the web. When we need to understand the article, we need to know what is the research question that is being dealt with. We need to know what is the research, the study design that has been selected. We need to look at the conduct of the study. We need to look at the statistical methods that are being used. Then we need to look at how it has been interpreted and discussed in the article. Critical appraisal is the next step, which is the most important. It's probably the most challenging, but there are very definite guidelines that are available in today's world which if we follow consistently and regularly, we will get better at it and we will not miss any particular points in the critical appraisal. And it is like anything, it improves with practice. And initially, a lot of guidance is required, but if we persevere, we can do it independently and effectively. So these are the various critical analysis guideline tools that are available. There are separate ones for case reports for care. There are separate ones for observational studies, which include case series,
Sir, can you please try to switch off your video? Maybe it is due to that
okay,
net issue. Better.
Sorry. Well, yeah. How is it now?
I think it's better now.
Okay. If it's still not okay in the next couple of minutes, you tell me. I will try and change to another network and see.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
Some audio disturbance is there. Some breaking. That's why. Okay, we will continue, sir.
I will then join from my mobile as well and see if that works better. Sorry about that. I'll share my slides from here, but
now it is better.
Now it's better. Better, is it?
Yes, sir. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So there are the scope guidelines of observation studies, which are the cohort and the case control. Then there are consort, and this is mainly for the randomized control trials. And there are meta-analysis today of observational studies, which is by the Moose guideline. The PRISMA guidelines look at meta-analysis of meta-analysis and systematic review, particularly of randomized control trials. And the diagnostic studies are a separate entity, and they go by the STARD guidelines. So if we go to this particular website, they will give a list of questions. There are short list and long list, and based on what kind of presentation you're looking at, you can take this and appraise it. There are also books, textbooks available which try and explain each of these questions in detail. There are articles published in journals like JAMA, which have also tried to enable people to critically appraise articles. So these are all things that will help. And one-stop place for getting all these checklists is the jupiternetwork.org website. Then the last part of getting a journal is clinical application, because it is just part of the clinical appraisal, but it deals with things like statistical significance versus clinical significance. Someone could have overpowered a study and found a very narrow difference to be very statistically significant, but that difference may not be clinically significant. And sometimes studies done in the Western population may not be applicable to our population, and so that needs to be taken into account. Another important aspect of intervention study, which the studies often do not give much importance to, is the number needed to treat, number needed to harm, and the cost of the treatment and the cost effectiveness. Sir, how is the audio? Is it better now?
Sir, can you try from the mobile? Still, there is some disturbance.
Sorry about it. I know why.
Mr. Mohan? Krishna?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Very clear. For me, it's very clear. Audio is clear.
Okay. Proceed, sir. Somebody was typing in the chat box that it is not clear. That is why.
How is it now?
Now it's okay, sir. Now it's okay. Better, far better.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, but the screen, you have to make it full screen.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, fine,
Okay.
fine.
No,
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay. Then finally, when you're presenting a journal, it's also about looking at the time given, not giving too much information on the slides. You could explain as you go along, lines per slide, to go slow so that people understand concept. Particularly, some research may have a particular methodology, particular analysis, which is quite new. So it may take time for people to understand, and it needs to be confident and clear. I'm going to focus today on the steps involved, the 2, 3, 4 steps. One on understanding the research article, two on critically appraising, and three on the clinical application. So when we need to understand an article, we need need to know this background information. We need to know a bit more about this background.
Plus, our audio is not here now. Hello.
I see you, but
Dr. Bani. Hello.
Am I audible? Oh, yes, sir. I'm not audible, is it? I stayed back to my. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. You're audible. Audible.
Sorry, I think again switching from one to the other is some problem. Is my slide full screen?
Yeah. It's visible. Okay. Okay.
Okay. So I was saying that we need to understand the research design a bit more. Look at the. We need to know the study design that is appropriate for the research question. The methodology may be slightly different from study to study that we need to go through. We need to have some idea of the statistical methods and see whether we have used it appropriately. And interpretation and discussion is left to each study. So we won't be looking at that. We'll be looking at the research questions, study design in a bit more detail, and briefly go through some statistical methods. So study design it's important to understand the study design before we go to research question, so that we understand which research question would fit into a particular study design. Now, study designs can be broadly divided into observational and experimental. The diagnostic is quite apart from this, so I put that separately. In observational, you do not do any intervention. You are only looking at whatever is just happening, and you can either just describe it or you can analyze it. Based on that, it's divided into descriptive and analytical. Descriptive is a case report, case series, or just a cross-sectional study. Now, the cross-sectional study can have some kind of analysis to look at some risk factors. Then it becomes the analytical cross-sectional study. That's why under analytical, we have cross-sectional, a case control, and a cohort. Now, case control and cohort are looking at the risk factor analysis, whereas a cross-sectional study is looking predominantly like at the prevalence of a disease. Now, once you have a prevalence of a disease, you can have people who have the disease and who do not have the disease, and you can look at various clinical, demographic, and other parameters which can tell you which cohort or which characteristic has an increased risk of having the disease. And that gives us a odds ratio. If it is a cross-sectional level, it's called a population odds ratio, because the study is primarily designed to know the prevalence, and the odds ratio is telling us what is the population or what are the risks within the population. Whereas an analytical case control or cohort study is primarily designed at studying risk factors. Only that the direction is slightly different. In a cohort study, we start with the risk factors, uh, a risk factor to develop a disease. So if you look at, say, whether preterm birth is a risk factor for developing asthma. You have a cohort of children who are born preterm and another cohort who are born term. And then you follow these children for, say, 10 years duration and look at the prevalence of asthma in one group and the prevalence of asthma in the other group. And you can now say, is preterm birth a risk factor for development of asthma? Now, then you can go on to say, what is the relative risk? You can quantify after knowing that it is significantly a contributing factor for asthma. You can say now the preterm birth has got, say, 2 times or 3 times relative risk of developing asthma in childhood. The problem with the cohort study is, the good thing is that it's very robust. It gives a very accurate estimate of the association. But the problem is it's time consuming. You need to wait 10 years to be able to generate data, or based on the study, the duration could change. Based on the disease condition and the relationship between the risk factor and the disease, the duration could change. Whereas a case control study is able to do this in short period of time. That you take all children who are 10 years of age and look at those who have asthma, and you take a control group who do not have asthma. Now you go back into their birth history and find out the proportion of them who were preterm born and proportion who were term born. Now again, you have a 2x2 table from which you can calculate an odds ratio, which is the estimate for a case control study, which will again tell you the odds of a preterm delivery resulting in that child having asthma is 2 times, 3 times, and so on. So it is a very quick way of doing the study. So that is the advantage. The disadvantage is, if it is a common disease, the estimates slightly vary from the true estimate of the relative risk. So in other words, case control and cohort are studies which look at the association of risk factors with disease. Now, this is all that is possible in a observational study design. An experimental study design uh, goes on to either randomized patients or non-randomized patients. In any case, you go ahead and intervene. You not only look at what is happening, you give some intervention. You you give it in a randomized controlled way, which is the most common and most effective way in which it is done. Like you give vaccine in one arm, placebo in other arm, and then you look at development of COVID infection, like in the article which is probably shared in the group. Now, you can have non-randomized studies, which are non-randomized due to several reasons, and it can be quasi-randomized. It can be because patient preferred to be so, but still you are giving an intervention. Like you could give rehabilitation to one group which is willing to undergo a program, and another group who is not willing to undergo the program. You just follow them up. Like we do studies like that for COPD, interstitial lung disease, and so on. There is an intervention, but it is not randomized. So just to understand the direction, so you have an exposure to outcome concept in cohort. You have a exposure already happened. From outcome, you chase back the exposure in a case control. In a cross-section study, both exposure and outcome have already happened at the same time. I've just listed some of the common research questions, what structure they would fall into. So you can either do a research to look at clinical features of a particular disease, say diphtheria. What are the signs and symptoms of diphtheria? We all know it now in the literature because someone has done a study of 50 patients with diphtheria or 100 patients and looked at how many have each of the symptoms. The second is prevalence of a disease. Prevalence is looking at the proportion of patients in a population who have the disease, and then is the risk factor, the risk factor of the disease. Then you want to know how much is the risk factor associated with the disease. Then there are several parameters which are used to assess the same disease. It may be a particular clinical examination score, or it can be a radiological score, or it can be a blood parameter which assesses the disease severity. And all these can be correlated with each other as against what is a potential gold standard, and we can correlate it. Or you can have a new intervention that comes in, and then you give that intervention and you want to look at the outcome. Or there is a new diagnostic test and you want to test that. Or you want to look at the prognosis of disease and look at the risk factors which would affect the prognosis. So each of these would fit into one of the study designs which we discussed in the previous slide. So I put it here for convenience. So the first three research questions would be addressed by a cross-sectional study. Now, once you've identified the prevalence and the risk factor, the strength of association of the risk factor can be assessed by a case control or a cohort study. The correlation again happens in a case control study. For an intervention, you require an RCT. A new diagnostic test goes through several phases, and the final step is a diagnostic randomized control trial, where in one arm you use the new diagnostic method, in the other arm you do not use the diagnostic method. And finally, prognosis requires a longitudinal follow-up of a particular disease to look at the risk factors which would predict the prognosis of the disease. Now we are moving on from understanding the research article, where we looked at the study designs and the research question, to a snippet of the basic statistics. So basic statistics are either can be descriptive or can be analytical. The descriptive ones can have continuous variables like age, which if normally distributed would be represented as mean and standard deviation, or if skewed or non-parametric distribution would be represented as median and interquartile rates. If they are categorical variables like gender, they would be the output would come as frequency and percentage. Now, the analytical part of it can again be divided into observational, experimental, and diagnostic again taking it from our study design classification, observational studies can have associations or correlations. Association is where the case control study, which has got the odds ratio, and the cohort study, which has got the output as the relative risk, comes in. Correlational studies are just cross-sectional studies where you look at a R value and a R square value and look at the direction of relationship between two parameters evaluating the same thing. And you also look at how well they relate to each other. Experimental studies output are relative risk, um, hazard ratio, attributable risk ratio, and finally, number needed to treat, number needed to harm, which many people talk very less about. If you look at a diagnostic study, you're interested in the repeatability, the validity, and the comparability of tests. Again, I think it is beyond this talk to go into the depths of this, but if someone is interested, we can look at it at some point in time. Now, just to understand that this center graph is what we call the normal distribution, where the mean, median, and mode are the same. The left and the right one have skewing. And when there is skewing, you do not look at the mean, which will be far from the central value. You look at the median and you look at the 1 quarter that side of the median and 1 quarter this side of the median. So this is a negatively skewed graph and this is a positively skewed graph. Now, I just listed few names of tests, which is just important to be aware of, so that when people talk about we use man-Whitney test, you know whether they've done it for the right, comparing the right outcomes. So if you have, whenever we compare two outcomes, we look at one parametric, non-parametric means whether they are normally distributed or skewed distribution. And then you look at whether they are continuous or dichotomous input and output variables. Based on that, you can know which of these statistical tests which will best bring out the outcome in your study. So this is important also to know when we are doing a study, so that when we go to the statistician, we know what they are talking about, and we'll be able to guide them better in doing the right tests. So those were the tests of association. These are the tests of correlation. This is the R value, again based on parametric, non-parametric, and the continuity / categorical nature of the exposure and outcome variable. We have different correlational tests. Now, from understanding the article, I'm moving on to critical appraisal of the article. And as I also already mentioned in the slide, there are several types of studies and several types of checklists for critical appraisal. It is not practical to cover all of them, but I will take one of the most important, which is a randomized control trial, and I will try and go through that briefly for us to understand how we need to critically appraise a trial. Now, it is very important to understand that there are numerous articles coming out in the literature. Unless we pay attention to carefully dissect, like a lawyer, we need to dissect these articles to know that the truth, how true the truth that is being presented is. If this is not properly done, we will be practicing what is just read in the research paper, which may not be actually the truth, or may be actually quite false as well, because there is so much influence that comes when someone is reporting a research article. So at this juncture, I would like you to please open the article which probably has been shared to all of you, which is a randomized control trial which was published in 2020, one of the initial trials of mRNA vaccine with placebo in a huge cohort of more than 30,000 individuals, a multi-center trial which looked at you give mRNA vaccine and placebo, and how much prevents COVID infection. So the first question to ask in any study, this is probably true for any study design, is the Picot statement. So a population should be very clearly defined. And this includes not only the inclusion criteria, it includes a specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is of paramount importance because whom they used it for and how well they used it secluded for that population will determine how you interpret the results of the study to the population you are dealing with or for the particular patient you are dealing with. And how much they deviated from this is also very important. The second important thing is the intervention. The intervention should be in very much specific. For example, if it's a vaccine, the dosage, the mode, where there are more than one interventional arms, what is the very difference between those arms should all be clearly mentioned. Should be mentioned in a way that if someone else would take this and implement it as a trial or to a patient, it should be very clearly possible to replicate. The controls also should be clearly defined, whether they got anything at all, whether they got a placebo, and what kind of placebo it was, whether it was similar, all that should be clearly mentioned. The outcome is the other measure apart from population and intervention, which is very important because what you describe as what you're going to measure in a vaccine study, it may be prevention of vaccine, prevention of infection, or it can be just looking at the antibody levels in the blood. And which of these it is and how precisely that is defined is extremely crucial for us to interpret. If studies do not say this explicitly, then we know that they have not been done properly. And in today's world, every randomized controlled trial need not only be registered, but most often need to have their protocol published. So you cannot kind of plan to do something and then change your outcome analysis because the results did not come in a particular way. So protocol is already published and even the analysis is already published what is going to be done. Then whatever happens after that is called a post hoc analysis. So that it is not primarily planned, is very clearly, explicitly stated right from the beginning. And time, at what time points the outcomes are assessed are also very important. Did the authors use the right type of study? So in this study, it was a comparison of a vaccine and a placebo. So RCT is the best one to address. So PICOT and the right study design is the fundamental basis. Only if these are addressed properly, we can go to the next step of critically looking at the various aspects of the study conduct. Now, this study, I'm going through about 12 points, which are not the elaborate list. It is a concise version for lack of time and giving you a glimpse of how research articles should be critically appraised. I'm doing this. But if you would like to elaborately critically appraise, if you go to the consort or Equator network, you can get the entire 22, 23 questions that are there. So was the assignment randomized? Now, this is basic for a randomized control trial, should be explicitly stated, and the kind of the method of randomization should be stated. If that is not clearly stated, then you know that although they say the name randomized, the way they perform randomization is not being adequately described. That means there could be a lot of bias and flaw in the conduct of the study. So it can be a computer generated randomized randomization. It could be a there are randomization tables available based on which it can be generated, but it should be very clearly mentioned. Now, where all the patients who entered the study accounted for at the conclusion of the study. Now, this is important, and this is one of the first flowcharts in the study. So, if you look at the article that has been shared, this is the first figure. It talks about the number of people who were screened to the number of people who were randomized to the treatment arm and the placebo arm, and how many of them received at least one dose, how many were included in safety analysis, how many went on to have the complete the trial in full, and how many were dropouts and for what reason. And based on this, at the end, who completed the study are called those who completed as per the protocol analysis, and including those who were followed up with their best and worst outcome situation is called the intention to treat analysis. Now, this has to be very clearly stated in a study. Every patient who started the study should have been accounted for at the end of the study. The clear reason if they did not complete the study should be mentioned. Next, we move on to blinding. Now, blinding can be either the patient being blinded, or sometimes it is the health workers who are administering the intervention being blinded, or sometimes it's the people who are assessing the outcomes who are blinded, because there are practical difficulties in blinding some of these categories of investigators slash patients. And sometimes it is the statistician doing the analysis who is blinded. And based on this, people call it single blinded, double blinded, triple, and all that. But those are not very globally accepted terms. So who is blinded needs to be stated. So it is an observer blinded. I think this study with the vaccine talks about the participant and observer blinded study. Now, one important point to note here is something called allocation concealment. And many not so good studies do uh, not say it clearly. Now, I think is often confused with allocation concealment, but it's quite different. Blinding is the group of people not knowing which group the patient belongs. The observer not knowing, the patient not knowing. Allocation concealment happens even before the execution of blinding. It is at the point of randomization. Now, if a particular sequence is there and the investigators know, sorry, am I audible?
No problem, sir. Yes, proceed, sir.
Continue, sir.
Continue, please.
Sorry. If the once if the study, the people who are conducting the study know that the allocation sequence of the randomization, they may know now the next randomized sequence output is the vaccine, say the placebo. Now, it may be someone who is vulnerable or known to them who's coming next in line for randomization. They may decide to remove that person and ask the next patient to come and ask them to come later for randomization. So this is called allocation not being considered. So after the randomization process, the allocation of which arm that particular patient is going to is concealed, usually in a opaque sealed envelope, until the time randomization, the patient's informed consent, everything is obtained. And now that seal is open to administer the drug or placebo to the patient. So the allocation concealment is very important and often not paid attention to in not so well controlled trials. Were the groups similar at the start of the study? Now, this is an important question, and the direct answer to this question is the first table in every study, which is the demographic study. Now, this is another way of looking at this question is, has randomization worked? That is what this question is actually addressing. Randomization is a process by which all known and unknown factors will become equal in the intervention arm and the placebo arm, but the demographic table will tell you whether they are equal. Some people put p-value in this table. That is not accepted. It is to eyeball. For example, here there were 8,062 males in the placebo group and 7,923 males in the mRNA group. And not just going through each of these, but more importantly, looking at pivotal points which can influence your outcome. For example, if you take, I just taken part of it. So, for example, the baseline SARS-CoV-2 status. whether it is positive or negative, is very important for the outcome of this study. So that should be more or less equal between the two groups. So what elderly, the age group is important because immunogenicity may be different in the elderly compared to the younger population. So we should look at key parameters which will impact the outcome and ensure that they are equal between the intervention group and the placebo group. Then another important question is, apart from your intervention, were the two groups treated equally? Now, suppose the group which received the vaccine were told to be more in protected environment, and the people who received the placebo were not advised to follow masking strictly, and they were more exposed to the disease, then that would impact the outcome of the study. So based on the study, we need to look at the intervention other than the intervention of the study, whether anything was different between the two groups, and this should have been reported. Key parameters such as that should have been reported by the investigators in the research paper. Then we move on to what the results are. The results are involves two questions. One is how much was the treatment effect, and secondly, how precise was the treatment effect. One is looking at the central value, the other is looking at the confidence interval. 95% of the time, where will the samples will the central estimate will the estimate like in this study they have looked at a incident rate. And we see that for the placebo, the incident rate of COVID infection was 56.5, which is the central value, the strength. And then it looks at the confidence interval between 48 to 65. And then it looks at the incident rate of the mRNA group. And then it looks like the percentage protection, which is 94, which is the central estimate. And it can range anywhere between 89% and 97%. So you have a central effect and a precision. The more close the confidence interval is, we know that much precise the outcome parameter is. So the last part, which is actually the tail end of the critical appraisal, is how you clinically apply this to your population. The first question is, can the results be applied to the local population? So what kind of population was the study done under, and is our population representing that population? Are any factors in our population which are different from the population, which would impact us using that information into our local population? Were all the clinically important outcomes considered? Like, for example, if it is a vaccine study and they have looked at only an antibody response, but not at prevention of infection, it doesn't have as much value as a study which looked at infection outcomes like the study which we were looking at. And the last point is, are the benefit worth the harm and the cost? Now, this is something where many studies do not give much importance. So for this, we have to construct a 2x2 table like this, and we need to look at the treatment. So on the left side, it will be vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, placebo, and the outcome. Outcome will be COVID infection, no COVID infection. And once you generate this 2x2 table, you can generate a first you can generate a exposure event ratio. That is, in all who received the treatment, how many of them had COVID infection, which is A by A plus B. Then in the control group, placebo group, you can find out how many had COVID. That is C by C plus D. Now the excess is called the attributable risk ratio. If you subtract this ratio one over the other, you will know the excess risk of the intervention arm over the placebo arm. And then you get the attributable risk rate. Now you inverse this. 1 by attributable risk rate is called the number needed to treat, which is, you will know, if I treat 10 patients with a vaccine, I will prevent one COVID infection. Now, once I get that, now I go on to do the same 2 by 2 table for the serious adverse event. Now, if the serious adverse event was, say, thrombosis, how many of them had a thrombotic event or mortality? Whatever it is, for each of these 2 by 2 table can be created, and you will get a NNH, which is the number needed to harm in the same way. And it may come something like, if you give vaccine for 1 lakh population, 1 patient will get a thrombotic event. Now you have a number needed to treat, number needed to harm, and now you know the cost of one mRNA vaccine. You multiply the cost of a mRNA vaccine into the number needed to treat. You'll know if you spend, say, the vaccine cost is 4,000, 10 patients. If I spend 40,000, I will save 1 COVID infection. And if I administer it to 1 lakh people, I will have 1 thrombotic event. This seems to be a cost-effective and harmless approach, and hence I will advocate mRNA vaccine for the prevention of COVID infection, as opposed to a costly intervention. Having a higher number needed to treat will be costly to save 1 infection or 1 life, and if it has a low number needed to harm, and the harm is something like every 100 patients, 1 patient will die. You're looking at a costly intervention which is to save 1 life or infection, which has got an important side effect. You would probably not recommend or not take that intervention on board. So this is a very important aspect of cost-effective analysis of knowing how much to spend to treat and how much harm it would cause. So with that, I would like to conclude to say that we should read a research paper well, but we should critically appraise it much more. And most of all, we should apply what we learn from the article into our practice. And as we keep doing this again and again, it will enhance our skills. We will be good readers, critically appraisers of implementing what we read into our practice, or not implementing what we read into our practice because we find that it is very cooked up or very shabby done, reported, inaccurate data, which is not worth reporting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a nice, excellent class. So I think there are some comments and some questions in the chat box. And I request the participants to unmute and ask your questions directly also.
Hi, sir. This is Dr. Sonal. I wanted to ask you, I'm a neonatologist. So there are a lot of studies where there is scoring of, USG brain and all that. How do we come to scoring? Like they give a score of 1, 2, 3, 4. How do we do that? Of different findings.
Okay, thank you for the question. Are you asking how do we analyze 1, 2, 3, 4? Is that what you're asking?
Sir. So sometimes what happens, there is a score for brain injury in preterm babies, okay? And they have different parameters and they give a score of say 1, 2, 3, 5 and then 10. How do they do that, or how should we score? And if we want to make our own score, how should we make our own score? Like for our population, how can we do that?
So, as I understand, there is a score which is already available in the literature, which you feel may not be exactly applicable in our population, and you want to develop a score. So
yes, sir.
In that situation, first of all, you have to look at what is the acceptable gold standard. Okay. So what is your outcome? What disease are you looking at here?
So we are looking. No, so we are looking at a term equivalent age, USG brain, to assess the scoring of brain injury. So white matter, cortical gray matter, or maybe deep gray matter, cerebellar injuries. And we are also looking at, say, corpus callosal length at term equivalent age of a preterm baby, or a CCF, that is corpus callosum fastigial length, which is a kind of a better marker of a head circumference of a brain growth rather than a head circumference. So how can we make our own score like that for our babies? We have no valid markers for our babies. So how can we do this?
Yeah, so first of all, we need to have for any new score, you need to have a gold standard or a silver standard. For example, a gold standard may be a brain biopsy, which you can't do, but you'll have a silver standard as to, this high-fi MRI, if we do, we will have accurate assessment of the brain injury. And then you look at parameters which you think are relevant. You can do a pilot study to pick up the relevant factors, and then you compare the gold standard or the silver standard with your factors. And then you will come up with a different weightage of different factors. One factor will have a odds ratio of 1.4, one will have an odds ratio of 4, one will have an odds ratio of 5. So you give different weightage for each of these factors in telling you about the quantum of brain injury or brain injury plus or minus. Then that together will form now a score. You have a new score. Now you have to derive it from a population, and then you have to validate it in a prospective cohort to see how well your validation gives you sensitivity and specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value in telling you the eventual disease. Does that make sense? One other way of analyzing it is, if you have already existing good parameters, you can, and it's continuous, like you're saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you have a score which is like 30, and it's a new score, and you're trying to look at how that 10 does compares well with this 30. You can do correlation, and if you say the R value is 0.8, 0.5, it correlates very well. So that's another way of looking at it. I hope I've answered at least part of the question.
Yeah, okay, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Suresh Vadakadam, sir, I think you had some doubts, sir. Can you please ask that?
So I'm Dr. Suresh. Hello, sir.
Yes, sir. I'm just reading. Yeah, you're audible. I'm just reading your question, if that is what you're going to ask.
Can you explain on your confidence interval when you're interpreting an application result?
Yes, sir. So when we have a outcome of a test, we have a central value. Now this is more like the mean. Okay. Now the confidence interval is a statistical value. I'll just tell you in a bit how it is calculated. It is a statistical value that tells you that 95% of the time, this value which you have found to be the central value will lie between this range to this range 95% of the time. There's only 5% chance that the value will lie outside of this range. Now, there is a statistical way by which this is calculated, and that is called standard error. So the standard error is slightly different from the standard deviation, which we are all familiar with. Now, the standard deviation represents that particular sample. Now, by a statistical formula called SD by square root of n, where n represents the sample size used in that population, the standard error is calculated, which tells you if this study is repeated 100 times, 95% of the time, this value will lie between this n and that n. That is the value that standard error gives. Now, the standard error is multiplied by 2 and subtracted on one side of the mean of the central value, like odds ratio, relative risk, whatever it is, and added to the other side of the central value. So you get a range from this to that, and you're 95% confident that your value will lie between these two. Did that explain that, sir?
In some studies, they won't give the confidence interval. They will be giving only the mean value. So how will you go about interpreting such studies?
Any study that does not give a variation of its sample is either not robustly telling what the outcome is, or it is trying to hide something. Or sometimes we need to understand whether it is the outcome or the input. Input is not usually by standard deviation. Input is by standard deviation, like all the exposure factors, demographics, all that is mean standard deviation or median interquartile range if it is skewed distribution. The outcome parameter is what is having a central value and the chance of it having over 95% confidence interval this side and that side. So if they have not given it, that's mean they are not saying something correctly. There's something wrong about what they're trying to say.
Okay, sir. Can you please highlight how if you're having a wider range of this thing, confidence interval, what does it mean? And if it is a narrow range, what does it mean?
Okay, sir. Thank you for that question. I think that will be helpful.
Okay, sir, can you stop sharing the screen, sir? Stop sharing the screen so that.
Sorry.
Okay, sir.
I'll try and put on the video, but I'm not, if audio is unclear, please let me know. So the confidence interval being very narrow tells us that the outcome is very precise. The central value is here, confidence interval is here. So we know if the odds ratio is 3 and it is 2.7 to 3.2 is the confidence interval, your 3 is very reliable. And suppose the odds ratio of 3 and the confidence interval is from 1.1 to 4.5, you know that the strength can be as low as 1.1, as high as 4.2. And sometimes when the confidence interval crosses the central value, I'm not talking about the central value of the study outcome. I'm talking about the central value of impact, which is when you look at a mean difference, 0 is the central value. When you're looking at odds ratio, relative risk, odds ratio, 1 is the central value. So if you have a risk of 2 and the confidence interval is 0.9 to 2.8, the confidence interval directly tells you that your value is not statistically significant. The p-value will be more than 0.5 because it is crossing the central value of 1. Similarly, when we're trying to look at mean difference, if the mean difference is -5 and the confidence interval is -10 to plus 1.5, here in a difference, the central value is 0. And now, because the confidence interval is straddling the central value, it is not statistically significant. Now, another important point to remember, people, when they want to prove statistical difference, can pseudo increase the sample size. Now, the precision is related to sample size. So, when you increase your sample size very high, your precision will become very narrow. So, then what is not clinically very significant can be projected as statistical significance. That is why whenever we are looking at the outcome of a study, first question to ask is it statistically significant? If it is not, you can close the chapter. If it is statistically significant, next immediate question should be, is it clinically significant? And for that clinical significance, there are already pre-described outcome measures in many parameters called MCID, minimal clinical important difference. Like for example, as pulmonologists, we use a test called walk test. In walk test, if you do one time and another time, the difference itself can be up to 30 meters, which is called the minimal clinical important difference. People do studies and say, now this intervention increased the walk distance by 28 and statistically significant p-value of 0.001. It's rubbish. Statistically significant, clinically no significant. So that's another usefulness of a confidence interval.
So one more point I want to ask is, you have told that when describing the baseline values and demographic data, there is no need to use the p-value.
Yes, sir.
So why is it so?
Yes, because again,
if you are giving the p-value, it again indicates that you have gone through that and so they are comparable. So it is adding some benefit, or it is a useless thing to mention that?
Well, earlier, if you look at studies about 10, 15 years back, all demographic characteristics had a p-value. If you look at all the high-end journals now, none of them will have p-value in the demographic table. And the reason, as I understand, is that we are looking at clinical significant difference, not at statistical significance. People may put p-value, and all p-values may be 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, like that. But there may be glaring differences between groups which will impact the outcome. So falsely, by putting that all the p-values are above 0.05, we are saying that the two groups are actually not different. But actually, one group had a significant difference compared to the other, which will impact the primary outcome. So that is why I think they've done away with p-value. It's more important to look at, for example, COPD studies. We look at smokers, non-smokers, FEV1 in one group and FEV1 in the other group, to look at how that will impact the outcome. Again, p-value can mislead people.
Thank you, sir.
I think there is one more question in the chat box regarding the ethical committee clearance. Sir. Can you take that question?
I'm not ethical. Okay. In our private practice with a small setup, from where to get an ethical committee approval for conducting a study? I think it's a very valid question. So there are institutions which have ethical committee, and there are some institutions together have more like a freelancing ethical committee, which are linked to multiple institutions. So you need to tap into ethics committee, which is linked to an institution or multi-institutional, or you can create one, get it registered under the authoritative bodies, and then you can conduct research. So it has to, because it has certain specifications. You have to have certain clinicians, certain number of statisticians, certain layperson, lawyer. So it has to have that kind of composition. So you need to look for an institution, combination of institutions having, or if nothing is there, you may have to create one. Nowadays, many of them are virtually possible. So you can explore some virtual ones which may not be even near your geographic area, but who may be able to accept your ethics proposals. There's one question on intention to treat versus per protocol analysis. So per protocol analysis is analysis of patients who have completed the predefined complete follow-up of randomized controlled trial. The intention to treat analysis takes into consideration not only those who completed the trial, but also those who were lost to follow-up. Because, for example, you're giving a vaccine, and then people withdrew from the study because they had some complication, or they had or they were more from a rural background and they did not want to participate, removed consent later, and they are the ones who had more infection. Now you will end up only by a per protocol analysis underestimating the rate of infection, and if that happened more in your placebo group, your effect size will change. It may even change the direction of the study. So the intention to treat analysis takes into consideration all those who are lost to follow-up, looks at their best case and worst case scenario. If they had the outcome, did not have the outcome, and gives the estimate. So like the study we saw, it had a per protocol graph for the incident rate. It had an intention to treat graph. If both are doing well, then you know it is consistent. If the per protocol is showing effect, the intention to treat is not. You have to really critically look at it to see why people were lost to follow up, and then how it has impacted your outcome. One question on non-inferiority trial. So any RCT can be divided into three. superiority, non-inferiority, or equivalence. It's difficult to explain in words better in a diagram, but I'll try and explain. Normally, all the trials that we see are all superiority trials. In a superiority trial, you're trying to say one, the intervention is superior to the placebo, like the vaccine is superior to the placebo. In a non-inferiority trial, there's already vaccine going on. You're bringing in a new vaccine, and you want to prove that this vaccine is not inferior in preventing infection to the other vaccine. Now, in an equivalence trial, you want to say that this vaccine is equal to that trial. So, in a superiority trial, you will have a pre-specified margin saying the new intervention is 15 times more efficacious than this. So, eventually, you will get a confidence interval, and you have to ensure that the confidence interval, both ends are lying above your pre-specified superiority margin. In an inferiority margin, you pre-specify an inferiority margin, and both your confidence intervals should lie above this inferiority margin. In an equivalence margin, if this is the already existing control group, the margin will be here. Confidence interval is this side and this side. And your eventual output should be within the pre-specified upper margin and below margin from the intervention group. So these are the types. The sample size calculation is slightly different for each of these types. And often a non-inferiority trial has slightly lesser sample size compared to a superiority trial. And it's all based on the question. If you are vaccine and placebo, there is no question of non-inferiority. Already existing treatment, and you want to bring in another treatment, not to replace, but to be an alternative, then equivalence and non-inferiority are other options. Is ATP and PP the same? What is MITT? I'm sorry, I have no idea what these expansion, the abbreviations stand for. If you can explain, I'll see whether I know it or not.
ATP is according to protocol and PP is per protocol.
I mean, it sounds like the same. I've not come across that.
And
I
what
know
is MITT? Because many report results we see MITT, TVC, etc. These. What is MITT? Modified intention to treat.
So they would have. So they wouldn't have included all the loss to follow up. They will have some pre-specified criteria where they will account for only certain group of individuals. Those who were lost to follow up before a certain time point may not be included. So it may be based on time point, based on certain characteristics which are not going to affect the outcome, will be removed from the intention. So it's somewhere in between a protocol and the intention to treat. But that should be very clearly defined, and usually it's defined upfront in the protocol that this will be our method of modified intention to treat. Okay. It can't be after the study is done, in order to make some p-value happen, you make some gimmicks and do it. It should not be like that. It is a pre-specified modified criteria for MIT.
Right. Thank you.
Can you explain continuous, median, interquartile range, parametric, non-parametric with examples? So a descriptive variable is divided into a continuous variable and categorical variable. I think all your queries are on continuous variable. So when a variable is continuous, for example, the commonest demographic parameter is age. Age normally will form a nice bell-shaped curve, like what I showed in the graph. Bell-shaped curve, where the mean, median, and mode will be more or less the same. In that situation, we report the mean and the standard deviation from the mean. Whereas sometimes, based on the population, if you have extreme values, like if you're collecting children for study, the age group is from 5 to 15. 70% of your population are 12 to 15. Now you will not get this curve. It will be like the peak will be more to the side. But here you cannot take the mean. because it is not representative of the central bank. And Indian mode are very different in this statistical representation. So here the acceptable one is the median. And median is the 50th centile value. Then your 50th centile, the 50th value when you arrange the values in ascending order, and then you take 25th percentile, that is the 25th percentile, and you're always only a percentile. You pediatricians, you look at the who stand percentiles for height, weight, and all that. So you take the 25th centile and the 75th centile. So the median becomes the 50th centile. Interquartile range is the 25th centile to the 75th centile. So the median may be 11 years. The interquartile range may be 8 to 12 or 13 years. And parametric and non-parametric are just different synonyms for bell-shaped curve, which is normal distribution, is called parametric distribution. Non-bell-shaped curve, which has got skewing, like more patients in 12 to 15 age group, is called a non-parametric distribution of that particular variable.
I think there are no more questions in the chat box.
Yeah, looks like.
Yeah.
Right.
So once again, thank you so much, sir, for making that topic very abundantly clear. You made it very simple also. Thank you so much. So one of the participants personal messaged me regarding whether you are conducting any classes for this thing, like I mean structured classes for statistics and these things. Are you presently
we from our department do not have any such thing, except we done a diploma allergy asthma program where we have this integrated into the personal sessions. Our biostatistics department does conduct some courses. They have taken a long pause during COVID, and they're restarting for this year. So I think May there are a couple of courses that is coming on, but I think the registrations are maybe already closed. So if you look at the website, if you look at the CMC Biostatistics Department website, you will get the updates on. It is cmc-biostatistics.ac.in. cmc-biostatistics.ac.in. That website is our homepage of our biostatistics department, and they frequently conduct both basic and advanced statistical methodology analysis, different kind of courses. So you can look at what suits your need and attend. That will be helpful. So I am not a trained statistics person. So few of those, I had an inherent interest. So I'm a person who loves and got into the profession and then realized my interest in biostatistics. So that is why my interests are so. But if you do have interest in some of these ones, would be helpful.
Krishnaman sir.
Yes, sir.
Krishnaman sir. With
Yes,
your permission, may I tell you something?
Yeah.
So there is a course on Swayam portal called the Basic Course in Biomedical Research, which is free of cost. The government of India site, there is Swayam portal is there, Swayam. So that is called the Basic Course in Biomedical Research. Anybody can register for that, and it's free of cost. You can attend to that course. It's pre-approved videos are there. You can do that, and if you want to get a certificate, you can go for an exam also. That is there. And if you go to the Swayam portal, you have other courses related to how to conduct the RCT. All those things are there in that site. So that's a good option. If somebody is interested in better to have an advanced learning in this course, it is offered there.
Okay, so thank you so much for the.
Thank you, sir. And as I say, all my colleagues and students, I think two important things if you want to keep research and this is going, because these things, unless you keep going, they don't stay and grow with you. So one is you have to have an active journal club. Even if you're doing private practice, you have to have at least once a month a group of practitioners coming together to critically appraising and looking at genre. Second, every practitioner's field is a field for research. The research is not only randomized controlled trials. Research can be done in your practice if you systematically capture data backward, which people which is also analysis of secondary data. If you have some predefined ideas, you put that through your practice, look at it 1 year down the line, you will get information on prevalence, on risk factors, and all that, and you can start doing research. So if we have that research mindset, then these things will gel well to bring our appraisal skills better. So research and journal club.
Okay. So thank you so much, sir, once again. I think there are no more questions. So take this opportunity to thank you for sparing your valuable time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for inviting, and thank you for so many of you for listening to me.
Thank
Bye,
you.
sir. Good night.
Thank you.
Good
Okay.
night.
Good night.